Gonna help me get the washes to the right color that I want. And then I have some scrap paper because you want to see what color your washes are before you put them on your drawing. I have a brush and I have my ink. And I have a paper towel, and I always have my newspaper. You always want to have newspaper. And then I've already mixed some washes, and I made a little scale, which we're going to be making little tiny scales today too. And we're only doing 3 different washes. So I've got my lightest value, which almost looks white. Like it's almost white, but you can see a tiny bit of a hard edge. And then I have my mid-tone and then my darkest. And this is about as dark as you want to get with your final wash, the darkest one, because you can just keep building on top of that. Because we don't want to get too dark too fast, because then, you know, we can't go back. So I have my water, and I have my my pan, and all these pans are also back there. So if you sit next to someone, which I don't think anyone in this class does, but if you're sitting like catty-cornered to someone, then I'd like you to share them. So you can have 3 and they can have 3. But since we're a spread out class, we'll just have 1 per person. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna open up my ink. And I don't wanna get this on my clothes. And then I'm gonna make my lightest wash first. So to make my lightest wash, do you think I'm gonna have more ink or more water? More water. So I'm gonna start, in all of these, I'm gonna start with just the ink. So I'm gonna do all of them, but I'm just starting with the ink. So when I dip my brush in there, I'm gonna barely put any ink on it. I'm not gonna dip it all the way up here or even to the top of the bristles. I'm just gonna do the very end. And then I'm just gonna tap it in the bottom a little bit. I don't want a lot of ink in there. So I got the tiniest bit in there. And you can add a little more later if it's still too light. But you want to start with as little as you can. And then I'm going to dip it again. And I'm going to dip it a little bit more. I don't want a ton. I might dip it like 3 times. And I'm just tapping it in the bottom. As long as there's more than that, there's more ink in the middle one than in this first one, then you're at least going to be darker than that one. And I'm going to dip it again, and this time I'm going to move on to my next one. And this one I'm really going to be putting a good bit of ink in there. But whenever you're making washes, you never want to just take the ink straight out of this container and put it on your drawing, because then it's just going to be straight, like it's going to be completely pitch black. And you want to build the value, not get dark too fast, because then you can't make it any lighter if you do want to change it. So I'm just going back and forth. I'm kind of eyeballing it, just trying to get it to be more than that one. And then once I do that, I'm going to clean my brush off in my clean water. And then this is going to be filled with water as well, but it's going to be clean. So after I put my ink in my trays in the right amount that I want, then I'm going to pour the water into the container with it. And for the lightest wash, I want more water. So even though there's a tiny bit of ink, I'm going to put a lot of water in there. So I'm going to fill it up to about that little crease line that you can see in the pan. And then I can see that it's not really getting as dark as mine over here. So I'm gonna put my brush in there because it's already had a little bit of ink on it. And sometimes if the ink's been sitting in the bottom, it'll kind of almost dry to the bottom of the pan. So you just wanna kind of loosen it up again before it dries completely. You don't wanna wait too long. So that could maybe still be a little bit darker. But I'm gonna move on to my next one. And do you think I want as much water as I put in there or less? Less. So you're doing like a little stair step. So you want this one to be a little bit less than that one. Probably a little bit more than that. And then I want this one to be the least. but I always want to mix it with water because I don't want it to be super pitch black. You want to build the value to be black if that's what you want it to be. And then I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna mix this one, and I'm mixing this one first because this one might be darker and I don't want to make this one darker. But if this one gets darker, then it's okay. So I got my values mixed, and maybe I want to add a tiny bit more ink to that first one. But I want to see what it looks like first. So I'm going to take my scrap paper and I'm going to dip it in there, and I'm going to kind of put it on there. And that's probably good, really, because it's barely gray. I don't know if you can see that. You can kind of see that it's barely gray. And that's kind of what you want. You don't want it to be super dark. Like, I'll show you this one too. It's a little bit darker. So I think that first one is actually probably what I want, is it to be as light as it can be without it being completely white. And then I'm gonna look at my second one. So that one's pretty good. And it looks about the same color as the one I did earlier, the washes I made earlier. And then my darkest one. And we're using drawing paper for the scrap paper because we're just seeing what color, like what the value is gonna be. We don't have a lot of this, paper, which is the watercolor paper. We don't have a lot of that. We're using it for our projects, and we're using it for our wash, our little wash light bulbs that we're doing, but we're not using it for anything else really. But I wanted you to use them for the for our tiny scales because I think that it's good for you to see how it works on that paper. But we're practicing on the scrap paper to begin with to see our colors, because we don't really have a ton of the watercolor paper. So for my scales, I want to make sure that I have some space in between each of them, because the way it works is kind of like watercolor, where if the paper is wet and then you go in with one value and then or a color, and then you go in with another color right next to it before it dries, then they'll just kind of bleed together. And I didn't really want my values to bleed together. I want to see them separately for my little scale. For our little scales that we're doing, we want to see them separately. So I'm gonna just make little squares. I'm gonna go in with the value that I made, the first one, the lightest. And like, I can barely even see that. You can see it pulling up though when I'm tilting it. So I've got it right to the edge. And then I'm gonna move on to my second one. I wanna do this where everybody can see it. So you can already see that that one's darker than the other one. And then I'll go in with my last one. And that's as dark as you want to get your darkest wash. You can make it darker by adding a little more ink, but you always want to have water in there. You never want it to be pitch black. The only time we really want it to be pitch black is when it's coming straight out of our pens. And then if your water is too dirty, because eventually this will end up being, you know, a wash on its own, then you can, and you want clean water, then you can dump it out and put more water in there. So that's kind of what we're doing with these scales. Let's see. We've got a couple minutes till lunch, but for now we're gonna work on, for the rest of the class, we're gonna work on our scales and get those finished. And then we'll move back to the washes, and we'll make these little scales. So we got a couple minutes.
Pay attention to what's set up when she's doing her wash. Look at everything that you're gonna need,